I had just driven my wife home from her therapy session when I saw her suitcase sitting in the middle of the yard. Clothes were scattered across the ground, lying under the harsh, midday sun. On the front porch, my daughter-in-law sipped her latte and said flat and cold, "Trash." Sarah tightened her grip on my hand. She was shaking from head to toe. This was the house she had lived in for 30 years. I didn't step out of the car. I understood the contradiction in front of me immediately. The one who created nothing was deciding who deserved to stay, and that was the moment I chose to shut the door on my silence. Before I continue, if you're listening to this story somewhere, leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel. A like or a share gives me a reason to tell you everything that happened after that moment. And now, let me take you back to that day, the day when it all truly began. I stayed still in the car for a few more seconds, long enough to understand that if I opened the door right then, everything would go in a different direction. Sarah was still holding my hand. That hand had grown thinner after the illness, cold, trembling slightly, as if she were apologizing for simply being there. I was used to controlling my emotions in a courtroom, but in that moment I had to draw on everything I had ever learned, just to keep my anger from stepping out before me. Through the windshield I watched my own yard turn into something unfamiliar. Sarah's brown leather suitcase, the one she'd carried since the early years of our marriage, lay tipped on its side beneath the oak tree. The lock had sprung open. An old sweater flipped in the wind, picking up George's red dust. Nearby stood her old sewing machine, the one I gave her in the 15th year of our marriage. It sat there crooked, like something that no longer mattered. And that was when the bitter truth settled in. The objects tied to a lifetime were being treated like leftovers, in the very house built by their sacrifice. Tiffany stood on the porch, sunlight flashing off her expensive sunglasses. She wasn't looking at us. She was talking to the two cleaning workers, her voice flat, like she was reading from a list. When Sarah opened the car door, the crunch of gravel made Tiffany turn around. Her gaze slid over Sarah, then stopped at the walker frame behind the seat. There was no surprise, only a decision that had already been made. I heard the comment clearly, even though it was said as lightly as the wind. No raised voice, no emphasis. Just a cold remark about old junk that didn't fit the new aesthetic. I had sat on the judge's bench for over 30 years. I knew when a sentence was meant to end a discussion. This was one of those sentences. Sarah lowered her head. She didn't cry. That hurt more than anything. She bent down to pick up a scarf that had fallen from the suitcase. Slow movements, as if she were afraid of disturbing someone. I stepped out of the car and stood in the middle of the yard. The summer sun in Savannah showed no mercy. It stripped everything bare, including my silence. Tiffany began to explain, but not to me. She spoke like she was presenting an approved plan. The east bedroom needed to be refreshed. Old furniture needed to be cleared out. Guests were coming and needed clean space. I heard the word guests and understood what she didn't say. In her mind, this house was no longer a home. It was a tool. Logan wasn't on the porch. That didn't surprise me. My son had always chosen to disappear when things became uncomfortable. I looked toward his study window. The curtains were drawn tight. I wondered if he could hear any of this, or if he had learned not to. One of the cleaners hesitated when he noticed me. He looked at Tiffany, then at Sarah, and stopped. I raised my hand for him to pause. Not because I wanted an argument. I just needed time. Tiffany frowned. She clearly wasn't used to her rhythm being interrupted. I bent down and picked up the sewing machine. It felt heavier than I remembered, maybe because memory was clinging to it. Sarah rested her hand on my arm, very lightly. She whispered that it was fine, that she could stay anywhere. That sentence cracked something inside me. A woman who once ran an entire household, now shrinking herself to avoid trouble. I looked at Tiffany carefully for the first time, not as a father-in-law, but as someone trained to read people in minutes. I saw the confidence of someone who believed she stood on the side of power, and I saw the urgency. She wanted this done quickly, before anyone had time to ask questions. I said nothing. I only nodded, as if I agreed. That relaxed her. She turned back to her phone and started calling someone, probably an interior designer. I helped Sarah gather her things one item at a time, slowly, carefully, like closing a long case file. When everything was loaded into the car, I shut the trunk. The metal sound echoed, dry and final. I turned to Tiffany and said we'd stay in the guest house for a few days, just to rest. She nodded immediately, unable to hide her satisfaction. The decision had come too easily. That confirmed my suspicion. This wasn't an impulse. It was a step in a plan. As I drove toward the back of the property, the old oak trees slid past the windows. They had stood there longer than I had. They had watched generations come and go. I wondered when people had started believing they could erase a lifetime, with a few short commands. The guest house was hot and damp. No air conditioning. Sarah sat down on a wooden chair, breathing heavily. I brought her water and placed the sewing machine beside her like a quiet promise. I told her this was only temporary. She nodded, but I knew she didn't fully believe it. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window listening to insects and the wind moving through the garden. In the silence I reorganized everything in my mind. Not for revenge, but to close a chaos that had gone too far. I had been silent long enough, and I understood that tomorrow silence would no longer be an option. The next morning the temperature in the guest house rose faster than I expected. The air was thick and heavy, like every breath needed permission. Sarah woke up early. She quietly folded the scarf from yesterday with a level of care that made something ache inside me. She didn't complain. That silence to me was the clearest sign that a boundary had already been crossed. I told Sarah I was going into the main house to pick up a few old papers. I spoke slowly, gently, so she wouldn't think I was about to cause trouble. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. That look wasn't resistance. It was the tired trust of someone who had handed the rest of herself over to me. I walked through the oak garden and entered the main house through the side door. No one stopped me. That, too, was a decision already made. They believed I had accepted my new place. I went straight upstairs and stopped in front of Logan's study. The door was slightly open. I knocked softly, just enough to keep up appearances. No answer. Inside the room was neat, orderly, a sharp contrast to the chaos in the yard the day before. I closed the door and stood still for a few seconds listening. When I was sure no one was around, I began to look. I didn't rummage. I only opened the drawers I knew my son used for important things. I had taught him how to organize files back when he was a student. Some habits don't fade easily. In the second drawer beneath a stack of architectural sketches, I found a white envelope. Sarah's name was printed on it, in handwriting that wasn't hers. Inside was a copy of a mortgage loan agreement. The figures were clear, cold. I read every line slowly. The borrower's name, the stated purpose, the term, and the signature at the bottom. I recognized that signature immediately, not because it matched, but because it tried too hard to. Sarah never signed her name in one smooth stroke. She always paused slightly at the last letter, as if making sure she was still there. Here, there was no hesitation, only hurried imitation. I set the paper down on the desk and took a deep breath. I didn't feel dizzy. I felt hollow. A part of me had still hoped this was nothing more than temporary arrogance. That paper erased that hope. This was no longer about attitude. This was a plan, already several steps in. I kept looking. In another folder were printed emails. They discussed a chain of spas facing financial trouble, unattractive numbers, highlighted promises. I understood then why this house had suddenly become valuable. It wasn't a place to live. It was collateral. Footsteps in the hallway made me stop. I folded the papers and slipped them into my jacket pocket. Logan stood in the doorway, tense. He asked what I was doing. I told him I was looking for some old files. He didn't meet my eyes. His gaze swept across the desk, then paused briefly on my jacket pocket. We sat down. There were no accusations at first. I placed the copy of the agreement on the table and slid it toward him. I asked one simple question. Does your mother know about this? Logan stayed silent. The silence stretched long enough to become an answer. He said quietly that everything had been calculated, that they needed capital, that the house was too big for two old people, that Sarah had agreed. She just forgot. I listened to every word without interrupting. I waited for him to hear the absurdity in his own explanation. It never came. When I said the signature was forged, Logan lowered his head. He didn't deny it. He said Tiffany was very persuasive, that everything would be fine once the project succeeded, that we would all benefit in the end. In that moment, I understood. My son had handed his responsibility to someone else, and called it a choice. I stood up and said I needed space to think. Logan didn't stop me. He seemed relieved that the conversation was over. That relief told me he had chosen the easier path long ago. Back in the guest house, I gave Sarah her medication and sat across from her. I didn't show her the paper right away. I asked if she had signed anything recently. She shook her head, confused. When I placed the agreement in front of her, she stared at it for a long time. Her hands began to tremble not from fear, but from realizing she had been excluded from decisions about her own life. She didn't cry. She only said she had tried not to bother anyone. That sentence once again made me understand how our silence had created space for others to step in. That evening I sat alone. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't rush into anything. I simply rearranged the pieces, the house, the contract, the upcoming party Tiffany had mentioned on the phone the day before. Everything began to line up into a single clear path. I knew that if I acted right now, they would call it emotional reaction. I couldn't allow that. I needed a moment where everything would be exposed, under a light they had created themselves. And when I thought of the living room, the place where Sarah used to welcome old friends, I knew exactly where my silence would end. The party was set for the weekend. Tiffany called it an intimate gathering, but the guest list was longer than I expected. Luxury cars began arriving in the late afternoon, lining the oak-shaded driveway. I stood by the window of the guest house, watching strangers walk into what used to be the quiet center of my family's life. None of them knew they were standing on a foundation that had already shifted. Sarah was asked to help out a little. That was Tiffany's wording. A simple dress had been laid out on the bed, neutral color, more like a uniform than clothing. Sarah put it on without asking questions. I caught a brief moment of hesitation in the mirror. Then she turned away. I didn't intervene. Not because I agreed, but because I needed everything to unfold exactly as they expected. I arrived late, not because I was slow, but because I wanted to enter when the room was already full. When I opened the living room door, the noise paused for a beat. Faces turned toward me, then quickly turned away. I recognized a few old acquaintances, people who had once shared meals at our table years ago. Their eyes lingered on me, then drifted to Sarah standing quietly near the drink station. Tiffany was at the center of the room. She spoke easily, glass in hand, like a true host. When she saw me, she smiled a well-practiced smile. She didn't introduce me. That, too, was a choice. I didn't need an introduction. Sarah bent down to pick up a glass that had fallen near a guest's feet. I saw it clearly, even from across the room. No one helped her. A few people noticed, then looked away. I walked over and placed my hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm enough to help her straighten up. I told her she didn't need to do that. Tiffany saw it. Her eyes darkened for a brief second. Then she turned back to her speech. When everyone had settled, Tiffany tapped her glass lightly. The room went quiet. She began talking about vision, about opportunity, about a new lifestyle. Familiar words, carefully arranged. I stood behind her, listening. I didn't look at her. I watched the faces that were nodding. At the peak of her speech, when she mentioned the support of family, I stepped forward. Not quickly, not abruptly. I simply stood beside her, close enough to draw attention. I asked if I could say a few words. Tiffany froze for a moment. She couldn't refuse without causing a scene. I didn't talk about money. I didn't talk about the project. I talked about the house. I said it had witnessed generations, that it was more than four walls. My voice was steady, not raised, not lowered. The room grew even quieter. I looked around, making sure everyone was listening. Then I took a small device from my jacket pocket. I said that before continuing. I wanted everyone to hear something brief. Tiffany frowned. She asked what it was. I said it was the truth. And the truth doesn't need an introduction. The sound played clearly in the room. Not loud, but unmistakable. It was Tiffany's voice. Familiar. Impossible to mistake. She was laughing. That laugh wasn't meant for guests. It belonged to a private moment she believed no one would ever hear. Then came the line light sharp about Sarah not needing to stand on the stairs when she's no longer quick. I didn't look at Sarah. I watched the room. A few people glanced at each other. Some set their glasses down. Tiffany moved forward, reaching to turn off the device. I raised my hand, signaling her to stop. I said the recording was only a few seconds long, and we had already heard enough. For a moment, no one spoke. Tiffany opened her mouth, then closed it again. She forced a smile and said it was a misunderstanding. That everyone says things they shouldn't when under stress. I nodded, agreed that we all have moments like that. Then I asked calmly whether signing someone else's name on a financial contract was also a form of stress. The question dropped into the room like a heavy object. I didn't name names. I didn't show documents. I just asked the question. Tiffany turned toward Logan. He was standing near the door, his face pale. The connection between them, once discreet, was suddenly obvious. I said this party was being held in a room where the true owner had been asked to step aside. I pointed toward Sarah, still standing upright, unmoving. I said that for me, that was enough to stop. There was no applause, no dramatic reaction, just movement. Some guests began to gather their things. A few approached Sarah, speaking softly, offering quiet apologies. Tiffany stood still, lips pressed tight. She looked at me as if realizing for the first time that I was never part of her plan. As the room slowly emptied, I knew the light had been turned on. Not a harsh light, but the kind that makes everything look different once you've seen it. I didn't need to say more. I let the silence do the rest. I walked over to Sarah and offered her my hand. We stepped out onto the porch together. Behind us, I heard Tiffany calling Logan's name, her voice sharp with urgency. I didn't turn back. I knew that from that moment on, the story had entered a phase they could no longer control. We didn't say a word on the walk back to the guest house. Sarah held my hand, tighter than usual. I felt her breathing slow down as if the house behind us was no longer pressing on her chest. Behind us, the living room lights gradually went out. The party ended in a way no one had planned, yet perfectly true to what it really was. I knew I couldn't let things stop there. Public exposure was necessary, but it wasn't enough. It only opened the door. The rest had to be handled with the things I had spent my entire life learning. That night, after Sarah fell asleep, I opened the old leather briefcase I had carried for years. Inside were documents I never thought I would need, against my own family. The next morning, I made a few short phone calls, not to complain, just to confirm. Each answer was clear, neutral. By noon, everything was in place. I told Sarah to rest. I said I had a few things to take care of, and I wouldn't be long. She looked at me, nodded, and didn't ask anything else. I returned to the main house early in the afternoon. No party, no guests, only the heavy quiet left behind after a night cut short. Tiffany and Logan were sitting in the living room. They didn't stand when they saw me. That didn't surprise me. They were expecting a conversation. I didn't come for a conversation. I set the briefcase on the table. I opened it and laid the folders out, straight aligned. I spoke slowly, giving each word its own space. I said the house did not personally belong to Logan, the way they believed. I said it had been placed into a family heritage trust years ago, with one purpose only, to protect the person living in it from impulsive decisions. Tiffany gave a thin smile. She said she had reviewed the paperwork. I nodded and said those were conditional use documents. The conditions were written very clearly. I pointed to a specific line. Any violation of the safety and dignity of the elderly resident results in immediate termination of residency rights. No debate required. Logan jumped to his feet. He said, "I couldn't do this." I looked at my son for the first time without trying to soften anything. I told him I wasn't doing anything. I was enforcing. I believe he understood the difference. Tiffany began speaking faster. She talked about investments, about risk, about how everyone makes mistakes. I listened until she mentioned Sarah's name. Then I raised my hand. I said we would not use her name to justify anything anymore. Not today. I took out one final document. I said that based on what had occurred, their right to reside in this house was officially terminated. Not immediately in a chaotic sense, but by procedure. The required notices had already been sent. The timeline was measured in hours, not days. Tiffany stood up. Her chair scraped loudly across the floor. She moved toward me, her voice rising. I didn't step back. I didn't need to. I said I understood what it felt like to lose control, but I would not accept turning that feeling into pressure on someone else. The doorbell rang at exactly the right moment. Not a surprise. I opened the door. An official stood there, polite, professional. He greeted me by name. There was no chaos, no spectacle, just the presence required to ensure things proceeded properly. Tiffany turned to look at me. Her expression changed. The confidence was gone. Only panic remained. She said, "I was destroying my own family." I replied that families are not destroyed by the people who set boundaries. They are destroyed when boundaries never exist. Logan said nothing. He stood still, arms hanging at his sides. When I looked at him, I didn't feel anger. I felt disappointment. I told him the next decision would be his. Not today, but one day. They began to pack. Not fast, not slow. The house moved in a strange way, as if it were exhaling after holding its breath for too long. I stood in the hallway, listening to suitcases rolling across the floor. The sound was different from the day before. This time it wasn't staging, it was consequence. When the door finally closed, I stayed still for a few seconds. Not to savor it, just to be certain I had done my part. I walked toward the back garden where the guest house still stood, modest and overheated. Sarah was sitting by the window. When she saw me, she stood. I said everything was finished. No details, no long explanations. She looked at me for a long time, then nodded. In her eyes I saw a relief she had not allowed herself to feel for months. I opened the front door of the house and invited her to step inside first, not as a victory, but as a return. And in that moment I understood something clearly. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply putting everything back where it belongs. That afternoon moved more slowly than I expected. There were no rushed footsteps anymore. No whispered phone calls. The house returned to its old state, but not exactly the same. Some new empty spaces appeared, and some heavy ones had finally been lifted. I opened all the windows, letting the wind from the oak garden flow in. Sarah stood in the middle of the living room, looking around as if she were getting reacquainted with an old friend. I didn't rush to renovate. I knew some things needed time. We started with the east bedroom, not because it was prettier, but because it was where Sarah felt safest. I hired a cleaning crew. Quiet, efficient. I asked them to keep the familiar layout. Just clean. Just fix what truly needed fixing. When the bed was placed back in its original spot, I saw Sarah let out a long breath, as if she had just set down a weight she never knew how to name. The old sewing machine couldn't be used again. I knew that the moment I picked it up from the yard. But I still brought it into the room and placed it by the window. I told Sarah I'd find a way to repair it. She smiled, shook her head, and said it wasn't necessary. A few days later I brought home a new machine. Same style. Same color. I didn't say a word. I just placed it where the old one had been. Sarah touched it lightly, then looked at me. That look told me everything. Some things don't need explanations. The following weeks passed quietly. I sent out formal notices regarding the legal action tied to the concealed financial matters. I didn't follow every step. I left that to people whose job it was to do so. For me, what mattered more was the rhythm of the house, slowly finding its balance again. Sarah began spending more time in the garden. In the mornings, she sat beneath the oak tree, reading or simply watching sunlight filter through the leaves. Logan called me once. A short call. He didn't apologize. He asked if there was still a chance. I told him chances don't come from words. They come from actions sustained over time. I didn't promise anything, but I didn't slam the door shut either. I told him he needed to stand on his own first, before thinking about coming back. The call ended in silence. I chose to see that as a beginning, fragile but real. I never saw Tiffany again. That was my decision. I didn't need another confrontation to confirm what was already clear. What remained would be handled the appropriate way. Not quickly, but steadily. I had spent my entire life understanding that fairness doesn't always feel comfortable, but it creates a foundation that keeps people from sliding further down. One afternoon, Sarah and I sat on the porch, 2 rocking chairs placed side by side, just like before. I brewed tea, the kind she likes. We didn't talk much, just a few short exchanges about the weather, the garden, small plans for the coming week. That ordinary calm, after everything, felt more valuable than anything else. As the sun lowered, golden light washed over the white walls. Sarah leaned back slightly and said she had been afraid of becoming a burden. I looked at her and said there had never been a single day she was a burden to me. I said the years we shared weren't something that could be dragged into the yard just because someone wanted to rearrange their life. I thought about what people might say behind my back, that I was too harsh, that I chose law over family. I had heard comments like that many times in my life. But at this age, my priorities were clear. I am a husband before I am a father, and protecting the woman who walked beside me through every season was never a difficult choice. As dusk settled over Savannah, the air grew still. I heard familiar insects, wind moving through the trees. The house at last breathed evenly again. I sat there not thinking about winning or losing, only that some lessons don't need to be taught with words. They're left behind by how you choose to live after everything has passed. Sarah held my hand. It was warmer than before. I looked out at the yard once, scattered with belongings, now only green grass and shade. I knew there would be other challenges ahead, but in that moment I believed respect had been put back where it belonged, and for me, that was an ending good enough to close this story. If you stayed with me until this moment, thank you for listening. If this story made you think about family, about respect, and about the boundaries that must be protected, please subscribe to the channel, like and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps stories like this continue to be told. Thank you for your time.